seen, I'd like to ask, how are you? But how are you? Really good. Good? Wet? Wet? Yeah. It's not the best day. Thanks for inviting me on this day to come here. So I actually attended the English UK Teachers Conference for the first time in 2010. And I've been teaching abroad, and I've just moved back to London. And this was one of the first professional development events that I attended as I was getting settled into a new job and my old home, as it doesn't sound like it, but London is where I call home. And I can hardly believe that was 6 years ago. And I've been back for this conference every year since then, and I can't believe another year has passed already and I'm back here. So I'd just like to say thank you to English UK for inviting me back, this time to open the day, and thank you all in advance for your attention. So first of all, my name and what I do. My name is Patsko, and actually I wear a number of different hats. My full-time job is working as a senior ELT research manager at Cambridge University Press, where I conduct and commission and consult research into language learning and language teaching. And prior to this, as I said, I was working as a teacher and as a teacher trainer abroad and here in London. So teaching students from all over the world and training both novice teachers and experienced teachers on the Trinity qualifications that Henry just mentioned. Outside my main job, I also work as editor of Speak Out, the journal of the IATEFL Pronsig, or Pronunciation Special Interest Group. And I write about ELF, or English as a Lingua Franca, focusing particularly on teaching materials and resources related to pronunciation and accents for a website called ELF Prompt, which I started with my colleague Katie Simpson in 2013. And my interest in ELF actually started several years ago when I conducted some research for a master's degree, because I was really curious about how English was being used, both inside and outside of the multilingual classrooms where I was spending most of every day. And that research involved 5 teachers at a language school here in London. And I interviewed them, and they did some things in their classroom, and they used some resource I designed, which we'll come to later. And one of the teachers said this. So I heard the term, English as a Lingua Franca, being used once or twice in the staff room, but not very often. So I thought, okay, it's not that relevant here. I don't hear people talking about it much. Do I really need to know about this? And I've spent a good chunk of my life in the intervening years trying to work out the answer to that question. Do we really need to know about this? So there are only 2 parts to this presentation. 8 things we really need to know, I think, based on the intervening years of research that I've read and done, and what we can do about those things. So we're going to build a bridge this morning between research and practice. And at the end of the presentation, there's a list of references and further reading in case you want to follow up with any of the things that I cover. And I'm also happy to share the slides by email, or they'll also be available on my blog, and there's a link at the end. So feel free to take notes if you like, but all the slides will be available, and the video, I hope, if it works. And I'll be here all day. So if you want to come and chat, just come say hello. So for the first 3 things, excuse me, that we really need to know, I'm going to go back to my teacher roots and give you a gap fill. Just make sure that you're all awake this morning. So for those of you who feel a little bit like the teacher I just quoted, this is a brief introduction. A brief introduction to the things that we're going to explore in the rest of this morning. For those of you who read the title, read the abstract, or have done some reading or research in this field already, here's an opportunity to revise. And for all of us, it's a chance just to reflect, to pause and reflect for a moment. Feel free to think quietly to yourself, if that is your preferred way, or feel free to discuss with someone near you, whatever makes you happy. So I'll just give you 1 minute to try and fill these 3 gaps. was in the classroom because I forgot to plan how to end that activity. So the answers.
You're right, Fred.
Now all of these are, I should say all of these are estimates. They're quite good estimates. They come from many, many years of reviewing and counting and trying to put numbers on these things, because it's actually quite hard to put numbers on these things. But David Crystal estimated in 2008 that there were at least 3 second language users of English for every first language user, and that was a conservative estimate. And as to the third point, there are some estimates that only 2% of teachers in the world speak English as their first language. English teachers in the world, that is, speak English as their first language. So we're looking at, generally speaking, an imbalance in terms of the amount of people using and speaking English as a first language versus how we often represent it. And this is quite important in our theme today. And so basically, in most interactions in English nowadays, English is not the first language of all or possibly of any of the participants, and they might not share any other language or any other first language. So in other words, English is their common language, their contact language. It's a lingua franca. And that means that for many people, English is their communicative medium of choice and often the only option. So what? So what, right? Does it matter? Does it even matter? We kind of know this. Yeah, we know that. We know those statistics. So why does it matter? And I want to just step back just a moment, just about 2,500 years or so, to Socrates. And Socrates argued that the most fundamental question that we can ask about anything is, what is it? So when people asked him these philosophical questions, like, is virtue teachable? He'd say, well, we can't really begin to think about whether that's teachable until we know what it is. And so I think when we say that we teach English, what are we actually talking about? What is English? Is it the same thing in all contexts? When it's acting, for example, as a communicative medium of choice in a context like this, what does it look like? Is it any different from what we think in our minds, what we intuitively feel it is? So what is it and what isn't it? Let's tackle that first, and then talk about whether it's teachable. So the fourth thing we really need to know is, what is English? And first of all, language, all language and all languages are fuzzy. They're not as neat and tidy as we might like them to be, and all languages exhibit change. So even if we try to codify things neatly and tidily, things will change. Words and sounds and structures and norms change over time as they're used in innovative ways by the generations of people who use them. So for me, what makes English so fascinating nowadays is the sheer number and diversity of people using it. And for language teachers and learners, obviously this rather complicates things. And we may try to simplify that reality. For example, by reducing all the possible things that could happen to a finite list of structures and rules to be learned. Or by avoiding presenting our students with all the many different voices they might hear. Or by telling them very clearly what's correct, what's a mistake. But we're in the business of language education. And I think we need to teach our students not only what English is, if we can teach them that, but also how it is used. And people interacting in lingua franca contexts do things a little bit differently, which we're going to come to. They have different priorities. It's not so much about acceptability into one group, for example. It's often about intelligibility. And so they do things, they have strategies, discourse strategies, things that make the flow of communication work. They're not always aware they're doing it. And what's interesting is when you read examples of this kind of discourse, often the things they're doing that makes the communication effective are things I don't remember ever teaching in a classroom. They arise naturally because people are motivated to make communication happen. And they also do things like they use idiomatic language differently. They may choose to avoid a particular idiom that they think their audience won't know, or they may choose to gloss it, to explain it, or even translate it. There's a lot of code switching in lingua franca interactions. So for me, the term English as a lingua franca, or ELF, simply describes how a person's English resources are being used. It's not a variety of English. It's too dynamic and flexible to be a codified variety, as it has to be when so many different people with different backgrounds and different expectations are involved. So it's not a fixed set of things that a person is using, or a fixed label which categorizes or limits them. It's the answer to the questions why and how, not what or who. And you'll notice that the definition I just gave about it being the communicative medium of choice is very inclusive. That includes native speakers too. So this is not a competition, it's not a battle. It's not saying that's wrong, this is right. It's simply saying a lot of stuff happens in English, and let's work out why people are doing what they're doing. What are their priorities? And pedagogically, this means that we're talking about a shift in perspective, a shift in conceptualization, a shift in orientation. So there is something we call English, but it's fuzzy. And the name that we give a language, even the word language itself, is quite a broad term for a collection of many, many linguistic resources which we can select from and apply appropriately for different purposes. So the ELT industry traditionally refers to English as a foreign language. But let's, again, step back a moment and just imagine some common scenarios in which English is used nowadays. So for example, the receptionist in a hotel in Mexico checks in some Japanese tourists for their holiday. Who was the foreigner there? Or a team of French engineers holds a meeting with their Turkish and Chinese collaborators about an upcoming project. Who's the foreigner there? Or a German student attends a seminar as part of a degree course in fashion design with Italian, Russian, Korean, Czech, American, British, and Argentinian classmates. Suddenly, do we have a bunch of foreigners there? Or again, do we have a diverse context of English interaction? So, because our industry traditionally assumes that this native speaker is the interlocutor, the person our students will be speaking to, I think we just need to question whether that is realistic for many students. It may be true, of course, in some cases, but can we assume? So again, we're focusing here on a simple shift in orientation. I'm talking about two different ways, and there are others, of using English. We're talking about a shift from seeing English this way, so having a variety of languages and cultures embodied in this non-native speaker, all converging to one target language and one culture. A shift from seeing English that way to seeing it this way. So from variety to variety. Variety of languages and cultures meets a variety of languages and cultures. The one thing they have in common to share is English. And so in 2016, those of us working in English language education are at the center of a very significant shift in how English is used, defined, represented, measured, even controlled. And so we have to consider the possibility, where appropriate, of shifting our orientation from the concept of English as a tool which foreigners use to communicate with natives to a tool which people use to communicate with people. And related to this is the fifth thing we really need to know, which is that nobody owns a language. Like most languages that are taught in formal settings after early childhood, the assumption has traditionally been that learners are aiming for competence in the second language, which will allow them to interact successfully with native speakers. It's quite straightforward. There's a clearly identifiable community of people who've used this particular language since childhood, and they understand it so intuitively and use it so effortlessly that we can trust them to know what they're doing and follow their example. But this underlying philosophy raises a number of problems, both logistical and ideological, and also economical and political and social, not least of which is this notion of ownership. A language isn't a thing that can belong to a person, like a book or a car. And moreover, if ownership is based merely on accidents of birth, then that automatically invalidates and disenfranchises huge swathes of people who have an interest in belonging to a particular language community right from the moment that they appear on the earth. So I, for example, did not ask to be born into a particular community or for any of the advantages or disadvantages that membership of that community has brought me in my lifetime. So my question is simply, is it right or even useful to confer prestige on a particular group of people because they happen to have been born in the right place at the right time? And people often use analogies. They use analogies like, well, okay, but if I were to learn Polish or Japanese, I want to speak it like a Polish person or a Japanese person. But English nowadays is not like Polish or Japanese. That's not to say it's better or worse. I don't believe in seeing languages that way, but it's different, it's used differently. It's not like languages which are spoken by a relatively small group of people within a relatively homogeneous cultural group, where you can assume a certain amount of shared background knowledge and shared expectations among its speakers. It's spoken all over the world by all manner of people in all manner of contexts, and it's not bounded by one geographical area or by one culture. So why do we persistently represent it this way? In our classes, and in our materials, and in the way that we market our industry. I think that when we do so, we're misrepresenting the way English is actually used, and we're doing it on an industrial scale. So we need to recognize that the English language is being used today by an enormous number of people on an unprecedented scale, in incredibly diverse ways. And this is the reality facing our students today, and I think it's quite interesting. So we can generate an interest in them as well. And I'd like to quote, again, from David Crystal, who said, all the way back in the year 2000, "We are already living in a world where most of the varieties we encounter are something other than traditional British or American English. We do our students a disservice if they leave our care unprepared for the brave new linguistic world which is English." Now, don't get me wrong. I realize it can feel a little bit overwhelming to consider English being used as an international lingua franca in the ways that I've described, and completely understandable fears and dilemmas arise, like where to begin? With so many accents in the mix, for example, how can we ever prepare students for everything they might encounter? Or what counts as correct then? Should I bother teaching the present perfect if it's so complicated and there's so many nuances to its use, and students are so infernally resistant to understanding it anyway? And so on. To which I would say that it's not that we shouldn't bother teaching certain things, but that we should teach them from a perspective which respects the variable ways in which they're used. So it's about equipping students with linguistic resources and with the discretion to select from those resources in a flexible, dynamic, intelligent way, so that they don't panic and fall apart when they leave the classroom and realize not everybody speaks that way. And as for where to draw the line on what we cover in class, well, it's never been realistic to assume that we will cover in one course everything a person might ever encounter when they leave the classroom. So we can only go with what is high frequency, what is statistically probable, and what is most relevant for a given group of learners.
And what is indisputably statistically probable for all learners today, and arguably relevant for the majority, is the use of English within a community of predominantly second language users, not first language users. So remember that in not just many, but most English interactions today, the language is being used as, quote, the communicative medium of choice and often the only option. Perhaps the most common objection when confronted with such an argument is, yeah, but students want and they need to use native-like English. Well, this may be true of some learners, certainly, and my point is not to pretend that nobody wants or needs these things. But based on everything we've just seen, is it reasonable to assume this? And we also need to ask, is it the case that students actually know what they need or want? In terms of what they want, there's ongoing research into this issue, and at first it appears quite conflicting, but when you probe into the methodology and the context a little bit, you start to notice interesting things. I'll give just 2 examples. So one frequently cited large-scale questionnaire study was conducted in 2002 by Ivor Timmis, and he found that a majority of students and teachers preferred to aim for native-like pronunciation, even if they felt this was an unrealistic goal. However, students were only given 2 options to choose from. Option 1 was, I can pronounce English just like a native speaker now. Sometimes people think I am a native speaker. And option 2 was, I can pronounce English clearly now. Native speakers and non-native speakers understand me wherever I go, but I still have the accent of my country. And to me this appears quite a reductionist view of the options open to students. So the researcher followed up these questionnaires with interviews to probe deeper into the participants' responses, but it would be quite interesting to see if the initial responses might be different if a 3rd or a 4th option were suggested to them. For example, I'm clearly not a native speaker. This would be unrealistic, but my first language is not identifiable from my speech. What I'm getting at is it the actual sounds of speech that students want, or is it the prestige associated with them? And my second example, another study in 2013 by Matthew Sung, was published with the fantastic title, I Want to Sound Like Heidi Klum. And this research involved more open-ended discussion with participants, and the findings suggested that while some learners regard native-like pronunciation as an attractive ideal, they did not necessarily consider it clear or intelligible enough to represent an indisputably superior model for their own speech. So much for what learners want. In terms of what they need, well, this may be surprising or seem counterintuitive, but there is ample evidence from research that communication in English in multilingual groups is often happening without major problems of understanding until a native speaker joins the interaction. And this has been shown time and again through studies using recordings, interviews with international students at British universities, studies of Erasmus students' spoken interactions, and so on. The earliest study I know of on this topic was published in 1979. So the authors studied the ability of 1,386 non-native listeners from 11 different countries to understand the speech of 9 different speakers, both native and non-native. And, I'm quoting from page 375 of this study, the native speaker was always found to be among the least intelligible speakers. This was in 1979, 37 years ago. I was not even alive then, let alone on my way to becoming an English teacher. And it's remarkable to think that despite over 35 years worth of studies showing again and again that intelligibility is not a quality which is inherent to any one accent, that native speakers are not necessarily the easiest to understand in international settings, and that English is truly a language for international communication in a way that no other language has ever been, we still offer our students only 1 or 2 native accents as models for both productive and receptive competence, and that we rarely dare to oppose market forces when they demand this. It's my belief that students who insist that they need native-like English, despite all evidence to the contrary, are trapped in an ideology cycle that the ELT industry perpetuates. We tell learners, sometimes quite openly and sometimes more discreetly, that all varieties of English are equal, but that some are more equal than others. It's like something from Orwell. And we all collude in this. We do it by including only native speaker recordings in our materials, by assessing learners' performance against a benchmark set by a traditionally prestigious minority, by publishing and buying guides that will get rid of your accent, and so on. And we even do this to teachers that we, the ELT industry ourselves, have trained and developed by taking their money and willingly affording them qualifications and then advertising jobs for which their qualifications are not enough, because decades earlier they were unlucky enough to have been born into a community that spoke a different language. We legitimize their training as experts and then delegitimize their professional value in the same breath. We give with one hand, we take away with the other. Given everything we know about how English is being used today and who is involved in using it, this makes no sense. So why does it still happen? The world is a very big place. There's plenty of space for all English users, regardless of when and how they learned to use English. Nobody should be at an automatic disadvantage according to accident of birth. At this point you may be thinking, okay, that's all well and good, but reality check. Students come to English-speaking countries for a reason. They want to sound like native English speakers and they need to integrate with native English-speaking communities. When in Britain, do as Britons do. When in London, do as Londoners do. The thing is, the when in Rome mentality presupposes that Rome is predominantly populated by Romans. So let's consider for a moment what Londoners do, for example. Now, London is widely recognized as the most multilingual city in the world. This is a quotation from David Graddall in 2006. In 2008, approximately 43% of primary school children and approximately 36% of secondary school children had a non-English home language. And 40 of the UK's higher education institutions, many with over 30% of international students, are based in London. And business and administrative studies have the largest proportion of international students, and a lot of people in the English UK conference probably teach students who fall into those categories. I'm talking about students studying subjects like engineering, technology, or law. So take a moment to think, are you teaching or have you taught any students who fall into these categories? What were their expectations about the way they would use English in their studies and in their lives? Now this is problematic, of course. It's one thing to describe what's happening in worldwide English usage, and it's another thing to try and prescribe content for our syllabuses and our tests. So, for example, despite the increasing internationalization of British universities, the most commonly used English language tests to secure university entry still conform very closely to native norms and expectations. Students may be expected not to deviate from a certain set of linguistic features when writing an essay, for example. And even their lecturers may be stigmatized by bringing a foreign accent along with their subject expertise when they come to the UK. So these are really matters for another much longer discussion. But for now, I would simply say, when have we ever thought it was necessary or sufficient to teach our students only that which they needed in order to pass an exam? The point is that we need to manage students' expectations. I often encounter this feeling that students come to the UK to learn from native speakers, and then they're rather surprised to discover a very multilingual, multicultural Britain, especially if they come to London. But I see this more as an opportunity than as an insurmountable challenge. we can exploit the multilingual nature of our classrooms to prepare our students for the multilingual nature of the English-speaking world. If we have one of those conversations with a student where they lament coming to the UK, how they paid for flights, they saved for months to book an English course, and they're quickly going bankrupt thanks to exorbitant London accommodation costs, only to find that they're surrounded by other non-native speakers who'd have the same bright idea, well, we can take this as an opportunity. That classroom which they find themselves in, full of learners from all over the world, is a beautifully convenient microcosm of the rich mix of Englishes that they're very likely to encounter outside the classroom, whether in London, in the UK, or anywhere else in the world. So good news. If you're teaching multilingual classes, then you've got a ready-made ELF environment to exploit. The people that students are engaging with inside that classroom are conveniently representative of the people that students are likely to be interacting with outside class as well. So how can we exploit this opportunity? Now, as I mentioned before, it's hard to be prescriptive with something so fluid. It's perhaps better to be descriptive and then make informed choices about what to focus our teaching on. And if I could summarize everything I've ever learned about ELF interaction and how to prepare students for it in 2 words, it's these. Be flexible. When using English among so many speakers with such diverse linguistic and cultural backgrounds, we need to be both willing and able to be flexible in what we do and flexible in what we expect others to do. So let's pause for a moment, and I'll give you a chance to reflect. 3 questions. First, what is the typical composition of your classes? Second, have you ever discussed, not just asked, but really discussed your students' needs with them? And third, can you think of any students who probably need to use English more as an international lingua franca than as a foreign language? I'll give you a moment to reflect.
Okay, thank you. I'll let you keep your answers to yourselves, although as I said, will be here for the rest of the day, and I would be interested to hear about the different classrooms that you teach in. So we're going to finish off the morning by looking at a few practical steps that we can take towards a more ELF-aware practice. And you'll find that it's not really a case of overhauling our existing practices, but more just of questioning the principles that those practices are based on. And so first of all, perhaps the simplest thing you can do is just to encourage curiosity. You need to raise awareness of students' own voices, of others, and I mean voice generally here, the way that people use English. It doesn't only have to be about speech. And of real-world communicative needs, both theirs and others, so they understand where people are coming from. And of course, of the importance of context in language use. And this can be done just through basic questions. It doesn't have to be a whole lesson or a whole course spent on this. It could be at regular points during feedback on activities. Questions like, how would you say it? Is that similar or different to this speaker? How? Why? What are some other ways? So again, this is about raising their awareness of the flexibility that they need, both in terms of what they might use and what they might encounter. In multilingual classrooms, you can refer to the teacher, the other students, and any resources you're using. If you are teaching in a monolingual context, recordings are great for this. We use them all the time. But just basic comparison and contrast, not to discover what's right or wrong, but simply to discover what happens. The other thing, of course, you need to do generally is needs analysis. And the example I'm going to give is particular to pronunciation, because that's my background and what I've done most work on. But the multilingual classroom offers 2 things which are crucial to successful interaction with people from different linguistic backgrounds to yours. And those two things are, first of all, exposure, and secondly, immediate feedback on communicative success. Because the true test of whether a person's speech is intelligible in an ELF setting is to speak in an ELF setting and to see if you're understood. So because a multilingual classroom is, by definition, an ELF context, then we can make great use of the students themselves as a resource for ELF-oriented communication development. And in terms of exposure, note that I'm talking particularly about focused exposure. Exposure alone is not enough. I can sit and listen to someone playing the guitar for hours, but I won't learn how to play the guitar. So it's not just about being exposed, just hearing it. It's about paying attention. And the way that I like to do this is through student-student dictation. I don't think I have time to show you this video clip now, but there's a link here. And again, all the slides will be on the blog, and you can find the video. The reason I did a video is just because sometimes it's hard to really imagine how this kind of activity looks. So you can look. But basically, you've just got 5 steps. You give each student a sentence to dictate. Could just be one taken from the course book, or it could be something you've prepared to focus on a particular thing. Then they take a moment to prepare how they will say them, focusing on how they think they'll make themselves understood. One by one, they dictate their sentence, and the other students write them down. And then afterwards, they can compare their notes, so they can see whether what they thought they heard is actually what they heard. You can help them identify points which were especially successful or problematic. And the 5th step is just for you, it's your homework, is to collect their notes afterwards and look at what happened, what was successful, what was problematic. And the reason, well, one of many reasons that I love this activity is that I learn so much from it. Things that I would have expected to be problematic or not are often completely the reverse. And again, in monolingual groups, this might be harder because students with the same first language will tend to converge on aspects of that language and understand each other because of that. But again, you can use recordings for this. And there are other examples on the blog where you'll find this video. One of the challenges that I faced when teaching in multilingual classrooms, and maybe you're already thinking about it, is that it's hard to know what the students will have in common in terms of needs. If I've got 12 students and they all have a different first language, I can't be expected to know enough about all of their first languages to work out where they might have a common area of difficulty. And there are grids published which do this. They have features of pronunciation down one side and different languages across the top, and then you can sort of find where they have things in common. But these all tend to be based on orienting towards native speaker accents. And the research I mentioned earlier, and that teacher that I quoted, focused on this problem. So basically I made my own grid because I wasn't happy with what was out there. And it looks like this. I think you'll agree it's beautiful. It was made in Excel, preferred program of designers everywhere. And this focuses on students whose goal is to use English internationally, clearly. So the features down the side are all things which research shows are priorities for lingua franca interaction. And that means it leaves out things that research suggests don't matter, like the sounds and the, for example. And I won't go into detail. Again, it's all available to download, and I actually brought 10 hard copies here if anybody wants one. Just queue up quickly afterwards. But the idea is to help me work out, if I've got students who speak Spanish, Portuguese, Arabic, and Turkish, what might be a common area of difficulty for all of those. And finally, so far what I've shown you is largely based on pronunciation because that's my own specialist area and what I've done the most work on. But there is other research into successful ELF use as well. And one researcher, a woman called Astrid Ollinger, also a teacher trainer, she analyzed the features of hours and hours of ELF interactions to compile some examples of what it is the good ELF user does. And these strategies relate both to preventing and to fixing communicative problems. And I think these illustrate nicely what I meant when I said we don't need to overhaul our practices, but simply consider the basis for those practices. And they were things like reformulation or circumlocution, talking around things when you don't have the word or when you think the other person might not know exactly what you mean. Really, really important in such a diverse communicative context. As is checking understanding and signaling understanding. Overlapping and turn sharing is often also just a good way to maintain flow of discourse and to show your listener that you're following, or take the opportunity to tell them that you're not. And being quite explicit, phrasing things explicitly or paraphrasing, spelling things out. And not necessarily waiting for it to be a problem before you do that, and we'll look at an example. And for the classroom particularly, recording communicative activities and then reflecting on these kinds of strategic moves. So your students do a speaking task, record it, and then listen to it afterwards to identify what it was that made it work well, or didn't. So they become more self-aware, and next time when they find themselves in a similar context, they can be flexible. So I'm going to show you an extract from how I introduced myself this morning. And I just want you to look for two things. Which of these strategies in the box did I use? Or are there any points where I could have used them, or other ones, particularly if it was interactive? This morning it was me talking at you, but let's imagine that I met you outside in the corridor and it was an interactive introduction. So just have a quick look at this, take a minute, again by yourself or with someone near you, to think, are any of these strategies used, or could they have been? I'm sorry we don't have more time to do all of these. I could do this all day. I do this teaching. So my answer key. A little bit of explicitness. First of all, my name and what I do. Not just saying, hi, I'm Laura. It's a really simple, small thing. But if you've got no clue where your audience is coming from, things like this are invaluable. Equally, Cambridge University Press. We all call it CUP, but I've been to talk to other people who call it CUP, and it helps to spell it out. The PRONSIG, the Pronunciation Special Interest Group. Again, as a member of that group, I just use that word without thinking, but I have to remember that not everybody knows that abbreviation. Things I could have done. Well, I could have spelled out that idiom. I wear a number of different hats. I know that I'm in the company of English language professionals and everybody loves a nice idiom, so I kept it. But I might not do that with a different audience. Equally, I didn't spell out ELT. You all know what ELT means. And I didn't spell out IATEFL. I'm assuming you all know. But that might not be a fair assumption. At that point, perhaps the other person could say, sorry, or check. And the little arrows point out where somebody could say something. So again, Cambridge University Press, for example. Everyone in the world seems to have heard of Cambridge University, and they often confuse that when I introduce myself, because they don't know press. What is that? Or you could have checked, speak out. That's a proper noun. Names are one of the last things you master when you're listening in second and third and fourth languages. Even in your first language, you hear a name you've never heard. So a good moment to check understanding. Or my colleague, who's that? How did you meet? And so on. So this is not revolutionary. It's not revolution. It's evolution. So before we all go on, and carry on with the day, I just want to mention one last thing. The majority of us are likely to walk away from this morning thinking and doing exactly what we did before. Many ELT practitioners, even in spite of all the things that we've just looked at about the increasing use of English as an international language, divorced from the norms and the expectations of a small subset of native English speakers, will nevertheless feel quite certain that fine, but it's not relevant for me and my students. And this fascinates me almost as much as the use of English as a lingua franca fascinates me. And I'd like to quote from a 2002 study from actually a different field, from the field of psychology, by Dawson, Gilovich, and Reagan, who said, "People are often able to believe what they wish to believe about the world around them, and at the same time, remain convinced of their own objectivity. Faced with an unpalatable hypothesis, people tend to ask, in essence, must I believe this? Rather than, can I believe this? The implicit question guides the ways in which they access and evaluate potentially informative data." So in other words, we all try to be rational. Of course, no normal person just walking down the street is thinking, yeah, I'm quite unreasonable. And I'm sure in this room, we all aim to meet our students' needs as best as possible. But studies show that it's really hard to change the way we think about things. If we have, particularly, an underlying motivation to think a certain thing, we're more likely to think it, even when presented with evidence to the contrary. So I've suggested today that some learners may well want or need to learn and use English as a foreign language in a similar way to monolingual native-speaking communities. But it's also possible, and even probable, that they use English predominantly within far more diverse communities as the communicative medium of choice and the only option. So if we can have more open discussions about who needs what for what purpose, we can help identify appropriate, realistic goals for learners and proceed to help them achieve those goals, whatever they are. So I ask that you keep all of this in mind as you go through the rest of today. Before you sit down in a talk or a workshop, abandon your existing assumptions. Throw them out the window and get curious. Because not only is English being used as a lingua franca every day at a global level, but it is also definitely relevant to many here. And with multilingual classrooms particularly, we're very well placed to highlight the diversity that students are likely to encounter outside the classroom, and to help them prepare to navigate it as effective international English users. Thank you.